The window was wide open, cold air rushed in. Henry's bed was empty, and in that moment, Elizabeth Morgan knew the man who'd destroyed her life had just taken the one thing she'd learned to love. This is the story of a mail-order bride who came to Wyoming with nothing and risked everything. But before we begin, if you love stories of courage, survival, and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment to telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. Are you Team Elizabeth? Let's find out together. Our story begins on a frozen December morning in 1878 on a train platform in Silver Creek, Wyoming territory. She climbed through a broken window in an abandoned cabin. Inside, a 7-year-old boy is tied to a chair. The man standing over him had promised her marriage, then destroyed her life. So she threw a rock at his head. This is the true story of the mail-order bride who became a mother, a fighter, and a legend. The boy's scream tore through the frozen morning like a knife through flesh. It was the kind of sound that made strangers stop mid-step, that made mothers instinctively reach for children who weren't there, that made grown men remember every fear they'd ever buried deep. Mama, the word hung in the December air, crystallizing in the cold, visible as breath and just as fleeting. But its echo would linger far longer than the vapor. It would change lives. It would break hearts. It would mend them again. Elizabeth Morgan stood motionless on the platform of Silver Creek Station, Wyoming territory. The year was 1878. The month was December. The day was the 15th, though she would later struggle to remember that detail through the haze of what came next. Her carpetbag sat at her feet, its broken clasp held together with twine she'd tied herself in a Philadelphia boarding house 3 weeks prior. The bag contained everything she owned in this world. 2 dresses, neither warm enough for Wyoming winters, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, her mother's rosary, the beads worn smooth from decades of desperate prayers that had gone unanswered, and 11 letters tied with a ribbon that had once been white but was now the gray of old dishwater and older dreams. She was 28 years old. She looked older. Hard work and harder years had carved lines around her eyes that had no business being on a face still young. Her hands were rough scarred from factory machinery and lye soap and all the brutal small violences that came with being poor and female in industrial America. Her dress was clean but threadbare. Her shawl was thin. Her boots had been resoled twice and would need it again soon. She had $47 folded in a handkerchief tucked into her bodice. She had the clothes on her back. She had a promise from a man named Malcolm Pierce that he would meet her at this station, that he would marry her, that she would have a home. She had nothing else. And she was about to discover that even those promises were as empty as the winter sky above her. But first came the boy. He emerged from the crowd like a ghost made flesh small and desperate and moving faster than should have been possible for someone so young. 7 years old, though, Elizabeth didn't know that yet. Dark hair that fell into eyes that had seen too much. A face that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so haunted. Clothes that were clean but worn lovingly, mended but mended nonetheless. Henry Callahan ran toward her as if she were salvation itself, as if she were the answer to every prayer he'd whispered into the darkness of too many lonely nights, as if she were his mother returned from the grave. And in that moment, on that frozen platform with snow beginning to fall in lazy spirals around them, Elizabeth Morgan's life split in two. There was who she had been and who she was about to become. The boy reached her before she could move, before she could speak, before she could process what was happening. His small arms wrapped around her waist with a strength born of desperation. His face pressed against the rough fabric of her dress. His whole body shook with sobs that seemed too large for such a small frame to contain. "Mama," he said again, the word muffled but unmistakable. "Mama, you came back. I knew you would. I prayed every night." Elizabeth's hands hovered in the air, uncertain where to land. The child was a stranger. This town was strange. This entire situation was so far beyond her understanding that her mind simply refused to process it. She stood frozen, a statue in wool and worn cotton, while around her the platform erupted in whispers. "That's not possible," someone said. "Catherine's been dead 10 months, another voice added. "Who is that woman? Is that the mail-order bride? The one Malcolm Ashford was supposed to marry? Poor thing doesn't know what she's walked into." The voices washed over Elizabeth like cold water. She heard them but couldn't quite make sense of them. Her attention was fixed on the child clinging to her, on his small hands, fisted in her dress on the way. His tears were soaking through the fabric to her skin beneath. And then there was a man. He materialized from the crowd like the boy had, but where the child moved with wild desperation, the man moved with the careful control of someone who had learned that showing emotion was dangerous. He was tall, maybe 37, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. His coat was worn but well made. His boots were scuffed but sturdy. His eyes were the color of earth after rain, and they held the kind of emptiness that came from losing something you could never get back. Nathaniel Callahan didn't know Elizabeth Morgan's name yet, didn't know her story, didn't know that she had traveled 18 days by train from Philadelphia, that she had sold everything she couldn't carry, that she had gambled her entire future on a promise from a man who had never intended to keep it. But he knew that look in her eyes. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 10 months. The look of someone who was drowning but had forgotten how to ask for help. The look of someone who had learned that survival meant swallowing pain until it became just another part of who you were. "Henry," he said, and his voice was rough, unused to gentleness. "Henry, son, that's not Mama." The boy's grip tightened. "No," he said, fierce and desperate. "No, it's her. Look at her, Papa. Look." Nathaniel looked, and his breath caught in his throat. She did look like Catherine. Same honey-colored hair, though Elizabeth wore hers pulled back severely where Catherine had let hers fall in soft waves. Same green eyes, though Elizabeth's held a wariness Catherine's never had. Same way of holding her shoulders straight even when the world was crushing her, though Elizabeth's posture spoke of long practice while Catherine's had been natural grace. It wasn't Catherine. It couldn't be Catherine. Catherine was 10 months in the ground, buried in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Silver Creek with a headstone that read "Beloved Wife and Mother," as if those 9 words could possibly encompass all that she had been. But for a moment, for one terrible, beautiful moment, Nathaniel let himself believe. Let himself imagine that this was some miracle, some gift, some cosmic apology for all the ways life had been cruel. Then reality crashed back in cold and unforgiving as the Wyoming winter. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in more ways than he could articulate. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. My son, he gets confused sometimes. He sees his mama everywhere. He doesn't mean any harm." Elizabeth found her voice finally. It came out steadier than she felt, which was something she'd had a lot of practice at. "It's all right," she said, and her hands finally settled on the boy's thin shoulders. The child was trembling like a leaf in a storm. She could feel his ribs through his shirt, could feel the desperate edge of his need. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, but I'm not your mother." The boy looked up at her then, and Elizabeth felt something crack in her chest at the devastation in his eyes. "But you look like her," he whispered. "You look just like her." "I know," Elizabeth said, though she didn't know, not really. "But I'm not her. My name is Elizabeth. Elizabeth Morgan. I came here on a train today from very far away. I've never been to Wyoming before. I've never met you before." She knelt down, heedless of the coal platform, heedless of the watching crowd so she could meet his eyes properly. "I'm not your mama," she said gently. "I'm so, so sorry, but I'm not her." For a long moment, the boy just stared at her. She watched hope drain from his face like water from a broken cup, watched something precious and fragile shatter behind his eyes. And then he did something that broke her completely. He didn't let go. Instead, he pressed his face back against her dress and held on tighter, his small hands fisting in the fabric as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. "Can you stay anyway?" he asked, his voice so small she barely heard it. "Please, can you stay anyway?" Elizabeth's throat closed, her eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. She'd learned long ago that crying in public only invited more trouble. She looked up at Nathaniel, desperate for help, for guidance, for someone to tell her what to do. He stood frozen, his own face a mask of grief and something else, something that looked like recognition. As if he saw in her not just his dead wife's ghost, but something of himself. Something of the way loss could hollow you out until you were nothing but shell and stubborn survival. Around them, the crowd had grown quiet. The whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching this small tableau, this moment of raw need and impossible circumstance. And into that silence came a new voice. "Miss, you look lost." Elizabeth turned her head. An elderly woman stood a few feet away, bundled in furs that spoke of wealth Elizabeth had never known. Her face was weathered but kind, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Are you looking for someone?" the woman asked. Elizabeth's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Malcolm Pierce. I was supposed to meet Malcolm Pierce." The woman's expression shifted. Something that might have been pity or might have been contempt flickered across her features. It was hard to tell which. "Ah," she said, and that single syllable contained volumes. "You'd best speak with Maggie Brennan at the general store. She'll tell you what you need to know." The woman walked away before Elizabeth could ask what that meant. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Ma'am, his store isn't far. I can show you the way if you'd like." Elizabeth looked down at the boy still clinging to her. "Henry," Nathaniel said gently. "Henry, you need to let the lady go." "No," the boy said, fierce and frightened. "No, Papa. Please, son. Please, Papa. Please let her stay. Please." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Elizabeth saw the muscles flex beneath his unshaven face, saw the war happening behind his eyes. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Some wordless understanding. Some recognition that they were both drowning and both too proud to admit it. "Miss," he said slowly, and Elizabeth heard the weight of decision in his voice. "My name is Nathaniel Callahan. This is my son, Henry. We own a ranch about 10 miles east of town." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "My wife passed last winter. Henry's had a hard time of it, as you can see." Another pause. "I'm in need of help at the house. Cooking, cleaning, tending to things. I can offer room and board in exchange for honest work. Nothing improper, nothing beyond that, just help, if you're in need of it." Elizabeth stared at him. This man, this stranger, was offering her refuge, was offering her exactly what she'd crossed half a continent hoping to find, but from an entirely unexpected source. "You don't know me," she said. "No, ma'am, I don't. You don't know anything about me. I reckon that's true. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous. I could be running from something terrible." Nathaniel's expression didn't change. "Could be. But I know what it looks like when someone's been kicked when they're down. And I know what it's like to need help when there isn't anyone offering." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, and the word came out more desperate than she intended. "Why would you help me?" Nathaniel's jaw worked. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying and failing to suppress. "Because my Catherine would have wanted me to. She was the kind of woman who couldn't stand to see anyone suffer. She'd taken strays, human or animal, didn't matter. If something was hurting, she'd find a way to help." He swallowed hard. "She's been gone 10 months now. I've been failing at just about everything she asked me to be. Maybe this is a chance to do one thing right." Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the store's door burst open with a bang that made everyone on the platform jump. A young man stumbled out, his face pale and panicked. "Fire," he shouted. "There's a fire at the Henderson place. We need every man who can ride." The platform erupted into motion. Men running for horses, women gathering children, the organized chaos of a frontier town responding to crisis. Nathaniel looked torn, his eyes moving between his son Elizabeth and the commotion. "I have to go," he said. "Can you watch him?" "Just for a few minutes. I'll be right back." Before Elizabeth could answer, he was gone, swept up in the surge of men mounting horses and racing toward wherever the Henderson place was. Elizabeth stood alone on the platform with a 7-year-old boy clinging to her dress and a carpet bag at her feet, and absolutely no idea what she was supposed to do next. Henry looked up at her with those two old eyes. "You won't leave, will you?" he asked. "You won't go away while Papa's gone?" Elizabeth looked down at this child, this stranger, this small, desperate creature who had somehow decided she was worth holding on to. "No," she said and meant it. "I won't leave. I promise." It was the first promise she'd made since arriving in Silver Creek. Unlike the promises that had brought her here, this one she intended to keep. The fire took 3 hours to put out. By the time Nathaniel returned to the station, the afternoon was fading into early evening, and snow was falling in earnest. He found Elizabeth and Henry sitting on a bench inside the station house, the boy asleep with his head in her lap while she stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. She looked up when Nathaniel approached, and he saw exhaustion in every line of her face. "Everyone's safe," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Henry. "The Hendersons lost their barn, but the house was saved." "That's good," Elizabeth said, her voice flat. Nathaniel studied her. In the lamplight of the station house, she looked even more like Catherine, and it made something in his chest ache. But there were differences too. Catherine had smiled easily, laughed often. This woman looked like she'd forgotten how to do either. Miss Morgan, he said, and she looked up. I meant what I said earlier. The offer stands. A place to stay, honest work, nothing more. You'd have your own room, your own space. Henry and I, we need help. You need a place. Seems like maybe we could help each other. Elizabeth looked down at the sleeping boy. His small hand was still fisted in her dress, even in sleep. What happened to his mother? She asked quietly, if you don't mind my asking. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Fever. Came through last winter. Half the territory was sick. Catherine caught it first, probably from nursing the Henderson children when their mother took ill. His voice went distant. She was fine for a few days. Then she wasn't. 5 days from first cough to last breath. Doc Hartley came out twice, but there wasn't anything to be done. She just faded, like a candle burning down. He paused. Henry was with her at the end. I'd gone to the barn to check on a sick calf. Wasn't gone more than 20 minutes. When I came back, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said and meant it. He doesn't talk about it. Nathaniel continued. What happened while I was gone? What she said to him? He just shuts down whenever I ask. But he hasn't been right since. Sees her everywhere, in every woman who passes through town. But he's never run to anyone before. Never called anyone mama. He looked at Elizabeth. I don't know what that means, but I figure it means something. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I came here to marry a man named Malcolm Pierce. I have letters from him. Promises. I paid for my own train ticket, borrowed the money from people I'll probably never be able to pay back. I sold everything I couldn't carry. I burned every bridge I had. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. And when I got to the station, he wasn't here. And I think I already know what Maggie Brennan is going to tell me when I get to that store. Nathaniel didn't say anything, just waited. I think Malcolm Pierce is a fraud, Elizabeth continued. I think he does this regularly, finds desperate women, makes promises, takes what he can get, and disappears. I think I'm not the first and I won't be the last. She looked up at Nathaniel. I have $47, Mr. Callahan. I have 2 dresses and my mother's rosary. I have nowhere to go and no way to get there. I have nothing. Her eyes held his. So yes, I'll take your offer. I'll come to your ranch. I'll cook and clean and care for your son. And I'll be grateful for it. Because right now, gratitude is about all I have left to give. Nathaniel nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then we have an arrangement, Miss Morgan. Elizabeth, she said. If I'm going to be living in your house, you might as well call me Elizabeth. Or Eliza. That's what my mother called me. Eliza, Nathaniel repeated, testing the name. All right, you can call me Nate. Nobody calls me Nathaniel except my father, and he's been dead 5 years, and good riddance to him. He reached down and gently shook Henry's shoulder. Henry, time to wake up, son. We're going home. The boy stirred, blinked, looked up at Elizabeth with confused eyes that slowly cleared into recognition. Miss Elizabeth is coming with us, Nate said. She's going to help out at the ranch for a while. Is that all right with you? Henry's face transformed. The grief didn't disappear, but something else joined it, something that looked dangerously like hope. Really, he asked. She's really coming. Really, Nate confirmed. Henry sat up and looked at Elizabeth with such naked joy that it made her chest hurt. Can I hold your hand, he asked. Just to the wagon, Elizabeth looked at this small boy, this wounded child, who had somehow decided she was worth holding on to, and felt something shift inside her. Something that had been frozen for a very long time began slowly to thaw. Yes, she said quietly. You can hold my hand. They walked out into the snow together, the 3 of them, and as Elizabeth stepped off the platform and into the wagon, she allowed herself one small dangerous thought. Maybe this could work. Maybe finally she had found a place where she could belong. She didn't know, then couldn't know that this was just the beginning, that the real challenges were still ahead, that the man who had brought her here was not done with her yet, that Malcolm Pierce was watching from the hills above town, making plans that would test everything she thought she knew about survival. All she knew was that for the first time and longer than she could remember, she wasn't completely alone. And sometimes that was enough. The wagon ride through the December dusk was quiet. Nate handled the reins with the easy competence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Elizabeth sat on the bench behind him. Henry pressed against her side like a small, warm shadow. The boy hadn't let go of her hand since they left the station. The town of Silver Creek disappeared behind them, swallowed by snow and distance. The landscape opened up into rolling prairie, endless white beneath an endless gray sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Elizabeth had never seen anything like it. Philadelphia had been all brick and smoke and crowds pressed too close together. This was space and silence, and a cold so profound it seemed to have its own presence. Miss Elizabeth, Henry said, breaking the quiet. His voice was small but curious. Yes, Henry? Are you sad? Elizabeth considered the question. Such a simple thing for a child to ask, such an impossible thing to answer truthfully. A little, she admitted, because the man you were supposed to marry wasn't there. Yes. Henry was quiet for a moment, processing this. I'm glad he wasn't there, he said finally. Elizabeth blinked. Why? Because if he was there, you would have married him. And then you couldn't come home with us. The simple logic of it, the child's faith that everything happened for a reason, made Elizabeth's throat tight. Henry, she said carefully, you know I'm not staying forever, right? I'm just helping out for a little while, until I figure out what to do next. Henry's hand tightened around hers. I know he said, but his voice said something different. His voice said he was already planning ways to make her stay. Elizabeth didn't have the heart to argue. The ranch appeared through the snow like something out of a dream. Or maybe a ghost story. It was hard to tell which. A 2-story house with a wraparound porch, the wood weathered but solid. A barn that needed painting but stood straight and strong. A chicken coop. A corral. A fence that listed slightly to one side but still did its job. Everything about the place said working family, honest labor, something built with determination and sweat. But there was something else too. Something Elizabeth noticed immediately. The curtains in the windows hung at crooked angles. The garden, buried now under snow, showed the dead stalks of plants that hadn't been harvested before the frost came. A child's toy, a wooden horse, lay abandoned on the porch steps, half covered in white. This was a house that had stopped being tended, a home that had lost its heart. It ain't much, Nate said, and for the first time Elizabeth heard shame in his voice. House needs work. Everything needs work. I've been trying, but I can't seem to keep up with it all. It's fine, Elizabeth said, and she meant it. After the boarding houses with their thin walls and thinner mattresses, after the factory dormitories where 6 women slept in a room, meant for 2, after all the places she'd lived that had never felt like home, this place looked like a palace. Henry jumped down from the wagon and grabbed Elizabeth's hand again, tugging her toward the house. Come on, he said, excitement breaking through his earlier tears. I want to show you my room and the kitchen. Mama used to make the best biscuits in the kitchen. Do you know how to make biscuits? Papa tries, but they come out like rocks. He says Mama took the recipe with her to heaven and won't share. Henry, Nate said, his voice gentle but firm. Let Miss Elizabeth catch her breath. She's had a long journey. Henry's face fell. Sorry, he mumbled. It's all right, Elizabeth said, touching his shoulder lightly. I'd love to see your room. Just give me a few minutes to warm up first, okay? The smile that spread across Henry's face could have lit the whole house. Okay, he said. I'll go get ready. I'll clean up my toys and everything. He raced toward the house, his boots pounding on the snow-covered steps. The door banged shut behind him, leaving Elizabeth and Nate alone in the yard. He gets attached, Nate said quietly. Too quick, too deep. His mama was the same way, his jaw tightened. I should warn you, he's going to test your limits. Push and push, trying to see if you'll leave. Trying to make you prove you're not going anywhere. What should I do when that happens? Elizabeth asked. Nate was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with 10 months of solo parenting, of trying to be enough when he'd never felt like enough, even when Catherine was alive. I don't know, he admitted. I've been failing that test since the day she died. Elizabeth studied this man, this stranger who had rescued her from humiliation at the train station and was now confessing his failures like sins he needed to atone for. Why did you really offer to help me? She asked. And don't tell me it's just because Catherine would have wanted it. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. Nate was quiet for a long moment. Snow fell around them, soft and persistent. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Because you didn't flinch, he said finally. What? in the store, when people were staring, when they were judging. You didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg. You just stood there and took it like you'd taken worse and survived. His voice was low, rough. I've seen people break under less, seen them give up, give in, let the world grind them down until there's nothing left. He met her eyes. You didn't break. And I reckon I needed to see that. Needed to see that someone could take a hit and stay standing. Because most days I'm not sure I can do it myself. The honesty of it stunned her. Before she could respond, the front door burst open again. Miss Elizabeth Henry called. "Come quick! The fire in the stove went out, and it's so cold in here." Elizabeth looked at Nate. Something passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of something. The acknowledgement that they were both standing at the edge of the same cliff, both afraid of falling, both too tired to walk away. "We should go inside," Elizabeth said. "Yeah," Nate agreed, picking up her carpet bag. "We should." They walked toward the house together, their breath making clouds in the frozen air. As Elizabeth stepped across the threshold, leaving the cold behind, she allowed herself that small, dangerous thought again. Maybe this could work. Maybe finally she had found a place to belong. The thought would prove both right and wrong in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The house was as cold inside as Nate had warned. Elizabeth could see her breath in the front room. The stove had indeed gone out, and the chill had settled in deep. "Let me get that," Nate said, moving toward the kitchen. "You just sit and rest." But Elizabeth was already following him. "I can do it," she said. "That's what I'm here for, isn't it?" The kitchen was in worse shape than the rest of the house. Dishes were piled in the sink, crusted with food that had been there for days. A pot sat on the stove with something burned black at the bottom, cobwebs stretched across the corners. A child's drawing was tacked to the wall, its edges curling with age and neglect. Elizabeth took it all in without comment. She'd seen worse. She'd lived in worse. This was just work. Work she knew how to do. She knelt by the stove and began building a fire. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but they remembered the motions. Kindling first, then larger pieces, arranging them just so. It took 3 attempts before the flames caught and held. "Got it," she said, feeling a small surge of satisfaction. Henry, who had been watching from the doorway, cheered. "See, Papa, I told you she could do it." Nate said nothing. He stood by the table watching Elizabeth with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not suspicion exactly. Something closer to disbelief. As if he couldn't quite accept that help had actually arrived. "The wood box is nearly empty," Elizabeth observed, straightening up. "Is there more in the barn?" "I'll fetch it," Nate said, reaching for his coat. While he was gone, Elizabeth looked around the kitchen more carefully. This room, more than any other, told the story of what had happened here. This had been a woman's domain. A place where meals were made and children were fed and life was lived. And then that woman had died and everything had simply stopped. She found a drawer full of dish towels, all neatly folded despite the chaos elsewhere. Found another drawer with utensils all clean and organized. Found a pantry with shelves still mostly full, though the food was getting old. And then she found the recipe journal. It was tucked in a drawer by the stove, a small leather-bound book with pages soft from use. Elizabeth opened it carefully, reverently, as if it might crumble in her hands. The handwriting inside was neat and precise. Each recipe was accompanied by small notes in the margins. "Nate likes extra butter. Henry won't eat raisins. Add a pinch of cinnamon, but don't tell anyone." These weren't just recipes, they were love letters. Messages from a woman who had expected to cook these meals for decades, not knowing her time was running out. Elizabeth closed the journal gently, her throat tight. She was standing in a dead woman's kitchen, wearing a dead woman's apron, about to step into a dead woman's life. And the strangest part was that it felt right, as if this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Miss Elizabeth Henry's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Yes, can I show you my room now? Papa's still getting wood. It'll take him a while." Elizabeth looked at this boy with his hopeful eyes and his desperate need, and she couldn't say no. "All right," she said. "Show me." Henry's room was at the top of the stairs, a small space under the eaves with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the prairie. It was tidier than the rest of the house, as if the boy had been trying in his own way to maintain some order in the chaos. A narrow bed with a quilt that was faded but clean, a small dresser with a cracked mirror, a wooden toy box overflowing with hand-carved animals, and on the wall, a drawing in a child's hand. A family, a man, a woman, a small boy, all holding hands, all smiling. Mama drew that with me, Henry said, following her gaze. The week before she got sick. She said families are made of love, not blood. That you can choose your family if you want to. He looked up at Elizabeth. Can I choose you? He asked so simply, so directly that Elizabeth felt her heart crack clean open. She knelt down to meet his eyes. Henry, she said carefully, you know I can't replace her. No one can. I know, Henry said. His lower lip trembled, but he didn't cry. I know you're not her, but Mama said I could choose, and I choose you. Elizabeth didn't know what to say to that. How do you respond to a child who offers you his whole heart with such simple faith? Let's take this one day at a time, she said finally. I'm here now. That's what matters. The rest we can figure out later. Henry nodded, accepting this with the easy trust of a child who had so little that he was willing to take whatever was offered. From downstairs came the sound of the door opening, of boots being stomped, of wood being stacked. Sounds like your papa's back, Elizabeth said. Should we go help him? They went downstairs together. Henry's hand in hers, and something felt settled in a way that nothing had felt settled in a very long time. That evening, after a simple meal cobbled together from what was in the pantry after Henry had been tucked into bed, Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the darkness. The snow had stopped. The sky had cleared. Stars scattered across the black like spilled salt. She heard Nate come into the kitchen behind her but didn't turn around. Thank you, he said quietly, for dinner, for helping with Henry, for all of it. It's what you're paying me for, Elizabeth said. Still, thank you. They stood in silence for a moment. Can I ask you something? Elizabeth said. Of course, what happened to your wife, Nate, was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and distant. I already told you about the fever, Nate said quietly. What I haven't told you is what it did to Henry. He was alone with her at the end. I was in the barn, and when I came back, he stopped, his throat working. He hasn't spoken about those last moments. Not once, won't tell me what she said. And I can't help but wonder if he blames me for not being there. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said, and she meant it. Me too, Nate said. They stood together in the quiet kitchen, two broken people trying to figure out how to survive the next day and the day after that. Then Nate cleared his throat. I should tell you something about Malcolm Pierce. Elizabeth turned to face him. What about a Maggie Brennan got a letter a few weeks back from her cousin Dorothy in Philadelphia? Dorothy worked at the same factory you did. Said one of her fellow workers had saved up everything to marry a man out west, and she'd heard troubling rumors about that man. She wrote to warn Maggie to watch out for Malcolm Pierce's schemes. When you walked into the store that day, Maggie put two and two together. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. That was me. I know, Nate said. Maggie didn't know it at the time, but when you walked into that store, I put it together. Dorothy's letter said Malcolm Pierce had a reputation, that he did this regularly. Found desperate women, made promises, took what he could, and disappeared. Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. You knew. You knew he was a fraud, and you didn't tell me. I didn't know it was specifically you until I saw you, Nate said. And by then the damage was done. What was I supposed to say? Sorry, ma'am. The man who brought you here is a con artist. You'd already lost everything. I figured you didn't need to lose your dignity too. So you manipulated me instead. I gave you a choice, Nate said. The arrangement I offered, shelter for work. No lies, no false promises, just what I said. Did you? Elizabeth's voice shook. Did you really? Because from where I'm standing, you let me think I had nowhere else to go, so I'd have no choice but to accept your offer. Did you? Nate asked quietly. Have anywhere else to go? The question hung between them like a blade, because he was right. She didn't, and they both knew it. I need to think, Elizabeth said, her voice tight. She walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs to the small room Nate had given her. It was spare but clean. A bed, a dresser, a window. More than she'd had in years. She sat on the bed and put her face in her hands and tried not to cry. She'd been lied to, manipulated, used. Again. Always again. Would it ever stop? Would there ever be a place where she could just exist without having to constantly be on guard against the next betrayal? A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiral. Miss Elizabeth Henry's voice, small and scared. Are you mad at Papa? No, sweetheart, she said, wiping her eyes quickly. I'm not mad. You sound mad. I'm just tired. Are you going to leave? The question stopped her cold. No, she said and meant it. No, Henry, I'm not going to leave. Promise, promise, we're strong. She heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, heard his door close, and she sat in her small room and wondered what exactly she'd just promised and whether she'd be able to keep it. Earlier that evening, as Nate had driven the wagon back from town with Elizabeth and Henry, Malcolm had followed at a careful distance. He'd learned the route to the Callahan Ranch, noting every landmark, every turn. Now, as darkness fell, outside, unknown to anyone in the house, a figure sat on horseback on a ridge overlooking the ranch. Malcolm Pierce lowered the binoculars he'd been using and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Found you, he said to himself. He turned his horse and rode back toward town, already making plans. The game wasn't over. It had barely begun, and Elizabeth, sitting in her room in the Callahan house, had no idea that the real fight was still ahead, that everything she'd survived to get here was just preparation for what was coming. But she would find out soon enough. They all would. The first week passed in a blur of work that Elizabeth attacked like it was an enemy to be conquered. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled and the wood gleamed. She washed windows until they caught the winter sun and threw it back in brilliant shards. She beat rugs and aired linens and organized cupboards and cleared away 8 long months of accumulated grief and neglect. Nate watched her with a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like guilt. You don't have to work so hard, he said one morning, finding her on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor. I didn't hire you to kill yourself. Elizabeth sat back on her heels and pushed a strand of hair from her face. I'm not killing myself, she said. I'm fixing things. There's a difference, is there? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to address. Elizabeth returned to scrubbing. The pantry needs restocking. I made a list. Is there a day you go to town for supplies? Saturday usually. I'll come with you, see if anyone in Silver Creek is hiring for sewing work. I'm good with a needle. Might be able to bring in some extra income. Nate's expression darkened. You don't need extra income. That was our agreement, and I appreciate it, but I won't be a burden longer than I have to be. You're not a burden. The words came out fierce, almost angry. Elizabeth looked up, startled. Nate's hands were clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight. Sorry, he said after a moment. I didn't mean to snap. I just don't want you thinking you're not wanted here. You are. Henry needs you. I need you. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with his own honesty. The house hasn't felt this much like a home since Catherine died. That's worth more than any extra income you could bring in. Elizabeth didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just returned to her work while something warm and unfamiliar uncurled in her chest. Henry, for his part, followed Elizabeth everywhere like a small shadow. He helped her hang laundry even though his arms could barely reach the line. He sat at the kitchen table and did his letters while she cooked. He told her stories about his mother, endless stories, as if, by talking about Catherine, he could keep her alive somehow. Mama used to make the best biscuits, he said one afternoon, while Elizabeth kneaded dough. They were so light they practically floated off the plate. Papa says yours are almost as good. That's high praise, Elizabeth said with a slight smile. Mama used to sing while she cooked too. Do you know any songs? A few. Will you teach me? Elizabeth paused in her kneading. My mother used to sing an old Irish song. Would you like to learn that? Henry nodded enthusiastically. So Elizabeth sang, her voice rusty from disuse but still carrying the melody. It was a song about home and longing and the way love could transcend even death. By the end, Henry had learned the chorus and his small voice joined hers in a harmony that made her throat tight. Nate stood in the doorway listening, though neither of them noticed. His eyes were closed and his hand was pressed against the doorframe as if he needed the support to stay upright. The sound of music in his house, again, of his son's laughter of life, returning to rooms that had been dead for too long, it was almost more than he could bear. That evening, after Henry was in bed, Elizabeth found the journal again. She'd been avoiding it, not wanting to intrude too deeply into Catherine's life. But tonight, with Nate out checking on the horses, she allowed herself to open it. The recipes were annotated with such care, such love. Instructions for bread that rose high and light. A stew that could stretch to feed unexpected guests. Cookies shaped like stars that Henry loved. and interspersed between the recipes were other notes, reminders, small prayers. Moments of Catherine's life captured in ink. Henry's first tooth came out today. He was so proud. Saved it in a little box under his bed. Nate worked so hard today. Must remember to tell him how much I appreciate him. He forgets to see his own worth sometimes. Snowed 15 inches last night. Beautiful but brutal. Worried about the Henderson family. Must take them supplies tomorrow. Elizabeth read until her vision blurred. This woman, this Catherine, had been so good. So genuinely, effortlessly good in a way Elizabeth had never managed to be. How could she possibly fill these shoes? How could anyone? You found her journal. Nate's voice from the doorway made Elizabeth jump. She hadn't heard him come in. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I shouldn't have looked without asking. It's all right, Nate crossed to the table and sat down heavily. She'd want it to be used. That's what all those recipes are for. To be cooked, to be shared. He reached out and touched the journal's cover gently, reverently. She started writing in this the week we got married. Said she wanted to remember everything. Every meal, every moment. Said someday she'd pass it down to our daughter if we had one. Or to Henry's wife if we didn't. His voice roughened. Guess she won't be doing either of those things now. Elizabeth closed the journal carefully. May I ask you something? Of course. What happened I know she died of fever, but what happened to Henry? Why won't he talk about it? Nate was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was raw. The worst part isn't that she died. It's that I wasn't there. 20 minutes, Eliza. I was only gone 20 minutes, and in that time, my son watched his mother take her last breath alone. He wiped his face roughly. Henry won't tell me what happened in those final moments, what she said to him. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe he needs something that's just his something he doesn't have to share. But God, it eats at me. He wiped his face roughly. Henry won't tell me what she said, what they talked about in those last minutes. Every time I ask, he just shuts down completely. Won't speak for hours afterward. So I stopped asking. But it eats at me. Not knowing what her last words were. Not being there to hear them myself. You think he blames you, Elizabeth said quietly, for not being there. Don't you? No, she was his mother. Of course he wanted those last moments with her. Maybe she wanted them too. Maybe she was waiting for you to leave so she could say goodbye to him properly without you having to hear it. Nate looked at her sharply. You really think that? I think your wife sounds like the kind of woman who would have thought about everyone's pain, even in her last moments. I think she would have wanted to spare you from watching her die if she could. Something flickered in Nate's eyes. Not quite relief, but something close to it. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not telling me it's my fault. Everyone else does, even if they don't say it out loud. I can see it in their eyes. It's not your fault, Elizabeth said firmly. Death doesn't work that way. It doesn't wait for convenient moments or fair timing. It just comes. She paused. I watched my mother die when I was 16. Consumption. Took her 2 years to finally go. I was holding her hand at the end. And you know what her last words were? Nate shook his head. She said, I'm sorry. Sorry for leaving me. Sorry for being sick. Sorry for being a burden. As if any of it was her choice. As if I had blamed her for dying when all I wanted was for her suffering to end. Elizabeth's eyes met his. Death does terrible things to the people left behind. Makes us feel guilty for things we couldn't control. Makes us question every choice we made. But the guilt doesn't honor the dead. Living does. Continuing does. Figuring out how to survive the grief and build something new from the wreckage, that's what honors them. Nate stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm against hers. You're stronger than you think you are, he said. You know that I'm not strong. I'm just practiced. Maybe that's the same thing. They sat like that for a moment, hands joined across a dead woman's journal, two survivors recognizing each other in the darkness. Then Henry screamed. They both bolted from their chairs, racing for the stairs. Elizabeth reached Henry's room first, Nate half a step behind. The boy was sitting up in bed, his face pale and eyes wide but not seeing. A nightmare. He was still mostly asleep. Mama, he whimpered. Mama, don't go. Please don't go. Elizabeth sat on the edge of his bed and gathered him into her arms. Shh, sweetheart. It's all right. You're safe. You're home. Henry blinked slowly, coming awake. Miss Elizabeth, I'm here. I dreamed Mama was leaving again. She was walking away and I couldn't follow her. I kept calling, but she wouldn't turn around. Elizabeth held him tighter. It was just a dream, just a bad dream, but it felt real. I know, I have those dreams too sometimes. About my mother, they feel so real that waking up hurts almost as much as losing her did the first time. Henry pulled back to look at her. Your mama died too when I was 16, almost 12 years ago now. Does it stop hurting? Elizabeth considered lying but decided he deserved the truth. No, but it hurts differently, less sharp. More like an old scar than a fresh wound. You learn to carry it. Henry thought about this. Then he said, I'm glad you're here, Miss Elizabeth. Even if you're not my mama, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here too, Elizabeth said and meant it. Nate watched from the doorway, his throat tight with emotion he didn't know how to name. This woman, this stranger who had appeared in their lives barely a week ago, was mothering his son with a tenderness he hadn't seen since Catherine died. And Henry was responding to it, opening up in ways he hadn't in months. Something was healing here. Something broken was being slowly, carefully mended. The thought terrified him almost as much as it comforted him. Saturday came bringing with it the dreaded trip to town. Elizabeth insisted on going despite Nate's visible reluctance. She needed thread and fabric if she was going to take in sewing work. She needed to prove she could contribute. You don't need to prove anything, Nate said as they loaded into the wagon. Maybe not to you, but I need to prove it to myself. Henry sat between them, still holding Elizabeth's hand like he'd done every day since she arrived. The boy seemed convinced that if he let go, she might disappear, and Elizabeth didn't have the heart to tell him otherwise. The town was busy despite the cold. Wagons lined the main street. People hurried between shops, their breath making clouds in the winter air. And every single one of them stopped to stare as the Callahan wagon rolled past. Elizabeth kept her chin up and her eyes forward, but she felt their gazes like physical touches. Felt their judgment, their curiosity, their speculation. That's the mail order bride, someone whispered, not quietly enough. Living in the Callahan house now, another voice added. Shameful if you ask me. No one asked you, Martha, a third voice said sharply. Nate's jaw was clenched so tight Elizabeth could hear his teeth grinding. She touched his arm lightly. It's all right, she said quietly. I've survived worse than gossip. You shouldn't have to survive it at all. But I do, so I will. They pulled up in front of Brennan's general store, the same store where Elizabeth had learned the truth about Malcolm Pierce just a week earlier. Going back inside felt like voluntarily walking into a lion's den, but she refused to let fear control her. Maggie Brennan looked up as the bell above the door chimed. Her expression was carefully neutral. Mrs. Callahan's housekeeper, she said, and the title felt like both an acknowledgement and a judgment. Good morning, Mrs. Brennan, Elizabeth said, her voice steady. I need thread, please. White and brown, and whatever fabric you have suitable for mending. Maggie didn't move immediately. Instead, she studied Elizabeth with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Heard Malcolm Pierce came by the Callahan place this week, she said. Elizabeth's stomach tightened, though her face didn't show it. How had news traveled so fast, small town, she reminded herself. Everyone knew everything. Yes, ma'am, she said simply. Heard Nate sent him away with some strong words. Yes, ma'am. Maggie leaned forward slightly on the counter. You know what people are saying, don't you? Elizabeth lifted her chin. I can imagine. They're saying you've got Nate Callahan wrapped around your finger. That you set this whole thing up, the abandoned bride routine, to worm your way into a widower's house in his bed. The words hit like slaps, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged people to hurt you more. That's not true, she said, her voice level. Doesn't matter if it's true, Maggie said. What matters is what people believe. And right now, they believe you're a schemer taking advantage of a grieving man. Then people are wrong, Elizabeth said, and there was steel in her voice now. I didn't ask for any of this. I came here to marry Malcolm Pierce because I had nowhere else to go. When he abandoned me, Nate offered me honest work, and I took it. That's all. Her eyes held Maggie's without wavering. If people want to make something ugly out of simple human kindness, that says more about them than it does about me. Silence fell over the store. The few other customers had stopped even pretending not to listen. Then Maggie did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but something that sounded almost like respect. "You've got spine, girl," she said. "I'll give you that. Most women in your position would be crying by now, or lying through their teeth." She reached under the counter and pulled out a bolt of brown fabric. "I don't cry in public," Elizabeth said, "and I'm a terrible liar." Maggie cut the fabric with quick, efficient strokes. Catherine was the same way, spine like an iron raw and no patience for dishonesty. She looked up. "You really do look like her, you know. First time you walked in here, I thought I was seeing a ghost." "So I've heard," Elizabeth said quietly. Maggie wrapped the fabric in brown paper. "Threads on the shelf behind you. Help yourself." When Elizabeth returned to the counter with her selections, Maggie named a price that was significantly lower than it should have been. "I can pay full price," Elizabeth said. "Consider it a welcome to Silver Creek," Maggie said. "God knows you didn't get much of one last week." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, genuinely surprised. "Don't thank me yet. You've got an uphill battle ahead of you in this town. People have long memories and longer tongues. Whether you climb that hill or fall is up to you." "I've been climbing uphill my whole life, Mrs. Brennan. I'm not about to stop now." Maggie nodded, something like approval in her eyes. Then her expression shifted, became more serious. "Malcolm Pierce isn't a man to cross lightly. He's got friends in this town. Important friends. If he decides to make trouble for you—" She paused. "Be careful, that's all I'm saying." "Thank you for the warning," Elizabeth said. "Wasn't a warning, just a fact." Elizabeth left the store with her package under her arm and her head held high, but Maggie's words echoed in her mind. Important friends, what did that mean? The sheriff, the banker, one of the ranchers. She was so lost in thought that she almost walked straight into the man blocking her path. "Miss Morgan," Malcolm Pierce said, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slippery. What a pleasant surprise. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. He stood before her, handsome, in an expensive suit that looked out of place in Frontier, Wyoming. His blue eyes were cold despite his smile. "Stay away from me," Elizabeth said, taking a step back. "Now, is that any way to greet your fiancé?" Malcolm moved closer. "We have unfinished business, you and I. Contracts to honor. Promises to keep. I'm not your fiancé. I never was." Malcolm pulled papers from his coat. "The paperwork says otherwise. And I'm a man who believes in the sanctity of legal documents. Aren't you?" Elizabeth's hands trembled. She clenched them into fists, hiding them in the folds of her skirt. "Nate Callahan told you to leave me alone." Malcolm's voice hardened. "Nate Callahan is a dirt farmer with delusions of importance. He's nothing, less than nothing. And if he thinks he can steal what belongs to me, he's about to learn a very painful lesson. I don't belong to you. You signed a contract. Contracts can be broken." Malcolm laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "Oh, Elizabeth. Sweet, naive Elizabeth." He reached out and touched her face. She flinched away. "You really think running to some pathetic widower is going to save you?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've destroyed better women than you. Women with money, with connections, with families who tried to protect them. You have nothing. You are nothing. And when I'm done with you, everyone in this territory will know it." "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind Elizabeth, deep and dangerous and familiar. "Nate." Malcolm's expression flickered for just a moment, then his smile returned, smooth and false. "Mr. Callahan, what a coincidence." "Ain't no coincidence," Nate said, stepping forward to position himself between Elizabeth and Malcolm. "Saw your horse outside the store. Figured you might be causing trouble." "Trouble? I was simply having a conversation with my fiancée." "She ain't your fiancée, and this conversation is over." Malcolm's smile tightened. "You're making a mistake, Callahan. This woman is legally bound to me. I have documents. I don't care if you have the Constitution itself." Nate said, his voice deadly calm. "You come near her again, I'll put a bullet in you. That clear enough?" The two men stared at each other. Elizabeth could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Then Malcolm laughed softly. "Very clear, Mr. Callahan. Very clear indeed." He stepped back, tipping his hat in a gesture that was pure mockery. "Good day to you both. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." He walked away unhurried and confident, a man who believed he'd already won. Elizabeth didn't breathe until he disappeared around a corner. Thank you, she whispered. Nate's hand found hers and squeezed once brief but warm. Let's go home. Home. The word wrapped around her like a blanket against the cold. They rode back to the ranch in tense silence. Henry, picking up on the adults' moods, was uncharacteristically quiet. He pressed close to Elizabeth, his small hand tight in hers. As they pulled into the yard, Nate finally spoke. He's not going to let this go. I know. We need to be careful. Keep the doors locked. Don't go anywhere alone. I won't be a prisoner in your house, Nate. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to be smart. Elizabeth looked at him. What does Malcolm want? Really, is it just about the contract and the money? Nate's jaw tightened. Men like Malcolm don't like losing. Doesn't matter what they're losing, just that they lost. You rejected him even if it was because he abandoned you first. In his mind, that's a blow to his pride. And men like him, they'll burn the world down rather than let a woman make them look like a fool. So what do? We wait, we prepare, and we hope to God he gives up and moves on. But he won't, will he? Nate met her eyes. No, probably not. That night, Elizabeth lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. Every sound made her heart race. Every creak of the house made her reach for the knife she'd started keeping under her pillow. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to footsteps. Soft, careful, coming from downstairs. Her heart stopped. She grabbed the knife and crept to her door, opening it slowly, silently. The footsteps moved through the kitchen. Toward the stairs, Elizabeth pressed herself against the wall beside her door, knife raised. Her hands were shaking, but her grip was firm. One step, two, three. The door handle turned. Elizabeth prepared to strike. Whoa! Nate caught her wrist inches from his face, his eyes wide with shock. It's me, Elizabeth's legs gave out. She would have collapsed if Nate hadn't caught her. I heard footsteps, she gasped. I thought you were someone breaking in. I was checking the locks, Nate said, helping her to sit on the edge of the bed. Couldn't sleep, kept thinking about Malcolm and his threats. They sat in the darkness, both breathing hard, both shaken. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said. I almost stabbed you. Almost is the important word there, Nate said, and there was the ghost of a smile in his voice. Then Elizabeth started to laugh. It was a broken, hysterical sound that turned into a sob halfway through. Then she was crying, really crying, for the first time since her mother died. Nate didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms and held her while she fell apart. I'm sorry, she choked out between sobs. I'm sorry. I don't normally do this. I don't fall apart like this. You don't have to apologize for being human, Nate said quietly. I'm just so tired, Elizabeth said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. I'm so tired of being strong all the time, of pretending everything's fine when nothing's been fine for years. I'm tired of being afraid and being alone and never knowing if tomorrow is going to be the day everything falls apart again. Nate's hand stroked her hair. Then stop pretending, at least with me. You don't have to be strong with me, Eliza. You don't have to be anything except yourself. Elizabeth pulled back to look at him. In the darkness, she could barely make out his features, but she could feel the warmth of his breath, the solidness of his presence. Why do you care? She whispered. Why does any of this matter to you? Nate was quiet for a long moment. Because you're the first person since Catherine who's made me feel like there might be something worth waking up for, he said finally. Because when I look at you, I don't just see a woman who needs help. I see a woman who survived things that would have destroyed most people. And that makes me want to be stronger, better, worth something. Elizabeth's heart was pounding so hard he must have been able to hear it. Nate continued speaking, his voice low and rough. I know it's too soon. I know you've got enough to deal with without me adding to it. But I needed you to know, in case something happens. I needed you to know that you matter. To me, to Henry, to this family we're building. Before Elizabeth could respond, a scream split the night. Henry. They were both running before the echo died. Henry's room was at the end of the hall. Nate reached it first, slamming through the door with Elizabeth right behind him. The window was wide open. Cold air poured in, carrying snow and darkness. Henry was gone. Elizabeth's scream tore from her throat. No, Nate was already at the window looking out into the night. Tracks, he said, his voice deadly calm despite the panic in his eyes. 2 sets of boot prints. They took him out through the window. Elizabeth couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She stared at Henry's empty bed, at the tangled blankets, at the wooden horse toy lying abandoned on the floor. "Get dressed," Nate said, his voice cutting through her paralysis. "We're going after them." But Nate, Elizabeth started. "Now. Every second we waste is a second they get farther away." 2 minutes later, they were both downstairs. Nate had his rifle and his pistol and was shoving his supplies into saddlebags with quick, efficient movements. "They've got maybe 10 minutes on us," he said. "Ground's frozen, but there's enough snow to track them." Elizabeth grabbed his arm. "Let me come with you." "No," Nate said. "It's too dangerous." "He took Henry to get to me," Elizabeth said, her voice fierce. "This is my fault. I have to help." Nate turned to face her. "If something happens to both of us, Henry's got nobody. I need you to stay here. I need you to ride to town and get Sheriff Cooper." His voice cracked. "Can you do that? Can you promise me you'll take care of my boy if I can't?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I promise." Nate nodded once, then before she could react, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was brief, fierce, desperate. "Stay alive," he said, against her lips. "That's an order." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness on horseback. Elizabeth stood in the doorway watching until she couldn't see him anymore. Her lips still tingled from his kiss. Her heart still raced from his confession. Then she turned and ran for the barn. She'd lied. She wasn't going to town. She was going to find Henry. Elizabeth had never been much of a rider, but desperation made her capable of things she'd never imagined. She managed to saddle the gentlest mare and point her in the direction of the tracks. The moon was bright, nearly full, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The boot prints were clear in the snow. 2 sets like Nate had said, one smaller than the other, the stride shorter. Henry had been walking, not carried. That meant he was conscious. Unharmed, maybe. The thought gave Elizabeth just enough hope to keep moving. She rode for maybe 20 minutes following the tracks as they wound through the prairie and into the foothills. The temperature dropped as she gained elevation. Her breath came in great white clouds. Her hands were numb despite her gloves. Then she heard it, a voice high and frightened. "Henry." Elizabeth dismounted and tied the mare to a tree, then moved forward on foot, staying low using the rocks and sparse trees for cover. She crested a small rise and saw it. A cabin, small and dilapidated, probably an abandoned trapper's shelter. Light flickered through the cracks in the shuttered windows. Standing guard outside, rifle in hand, was a large man with a scar across his cheek. One of the riders who'd come to the ranch with threats about fires and barns burning. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just Malcolm. This was planned, organized. She circled around to the back of the cabin, moving as quietly as she could manage. There was no guard here. They probably figured they were safe this far from civilization. They'd figured wrong. Through a gap in a broken shutter, Elizabeth could see inside. Henry sat on a wooden chair, his hands tied behind his back. His face was streaked with tears, but his chin was up, defiant. Malcolm stood over him, talking in a low voice Elizabeth couldn't quite hear. Rage flooded through her, hot and all-consuming. This man had lured her across a continent with lies. He'd abandoned her in a strange place with nothing. And now he'd taken a child, an innocent 7-year-old boy, and tied him to a chair in an abandoned cabin like some kind of animal. She looked around for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hands closed around a rusted horseshoe half buried in the snow. Not much, but it would have to do. Elizabeth took a deep breath, said a prayer to a god she wasn't sure was listening, and threw the horseshoe at the cabin's front wall. The clang of metal on wood rang out like a gunshot. "What the hell?" The guard's voice. Footsteps crunching through snow, moving toward the sound. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rock, climbed through the broken window, and dropped into the cabin. Malcolm spun around, his eyes going wide. "You." Elizabeth threw the rock. It caught him square in the forehead. He staggered backward, cursing, blood streaming down his face. "Miss Eliza," Henry shouted, his voice pure joy and relief. "You came." "I came," Elizabeth said, already moving to him, working at the knots binding his hands. "Hold still, sweetheart. I've got you." Malcolm lunged for her. "You miserable little witch." Elizabeth dodged, but not fast enough. His fist caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling across the rough wooden floor. "You've ruined everything," Malcolm snarled, advancing on her. "Henry, run!" Elizabeth shouted, scrambling backward. "Go find your papa. Now, I'm not leaving you," Henry cried. "Go!" Elizabeth's voice was fierce. "Promise." Henry hesitated for one agonizing second, his face torn. Then he ran his small body shooting through the cabin door and into the darkness. Malcolm made a grab for him but missed. "Jenkins," he roared, "get the boy." The guard's voice came from outside. "Boss, I think there's someone else out here." Then a gunshot split the night. Malcolm froze. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Then Nate's voice rang out clear and cold as the winter air. "Next one goes through your head. Both of you. Drop your weapons and get on the ground." Malcolm's face contorted with rage, but he wasn't stupid. He raised his hand slowly. Nate appeared in the doorway, rifle trained on Malcolm's chest. Behind him, the guard lay face down in the snow, hands behind his head. And tucked safely behind Nate was Henry, alive and whole. "Henry, you okay?" Nate asked without taking his eyes off Malcolm. "I'm okay, Papa." Henry's voice came from behind his father. "Miss Eliza saved me." She threw a rock at the bad man's head. Despite everything, Elizabeth felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. Nate's eyes found hers across the cabin. "You were supposed to go to town." "I lied," Elizabeth said. "I noticed." Something flickered in his expression. Not anger, something warmer. "We'll talk about that later." "Looking forward to it," Elizabeth said. Malcolm sneered. "How touching." "The dirt farmer and his mail-order bride. You think this changes anything? I have friends, lawyers, connections that reach all the way to the territorial governor. You can't touch me." "Maybe not," Nate said, his voice ice. "But Sheriff Cooper can. And after tonight, you've given him plenty of reason to try." As if summoned by his name, the sound of multiple horses reached their ears. Sheriff Cooper appeared moments later, flanked by 4 deputies. "Got here as fast as we could," the sheriff said to Nate. "Your boy came running into town earlier, screaming about a kidnapping. Woke up half the population. We've been tracking you ever since." His eyes moved to Malcolm. "Mr. Pierce, can't say I'm surprised to find you here." "This is a misunderstanding," Sheriff Malcolm started. "These people attacked me." "Save it," Sheriff Cooper said, his voice flat. "We've got 3 other women in this territory who'll testify to your misunderstandings. Been building a case against you for months. Tonight just gave me the excuse I needed." Malcolm's face went pale. "You can't arrest me. My lawyer will have something to say about this." "Your lawyer can meet you in my jail," the sheriff said. He nodded to his deputies. "Take him. And that one too." As Malcolm was dragged away in chains, still protesting, still threatening, Elizabeth watched with empty eyes. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not even relief. Just exhaustion so profound it made her bones ache. Miss Eliza, Henry crashed into her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You came for me. You really came." "Of course I came," Elizabeth said, holding him tight. "I promised I'd keep you safe, didn't I? But you could have been hurt. The bad man could have killed you." Elizabeth knelt down to meet his eyes. "Do you know why I came, Henry?" Even though it was dangerous, Henry shook his head. "Because that's what family does." Elizabeth touched his face gently. "We don't leave each other behind, ever." Henry's eyes widened. "Family, if you'll have me," Elizabeth said. The smile that spread across Henry's face was brighter than the moon. "Papa," he shouted, "Miss Eliza says we're family. She says she's not leaving." Nate appeared beside them, exhaustion and relief warring in his expression. "That's so?" he asked quietly. "If you'll have me," Elizabeth repeated, looking up at him. Nate reached down and pulled her to her feet, then into his arms. "I'll have you," he said against her hair. "Today, tomorrow, for as long as you'll stay." Elizabeth buried her face in his chest and let herself believe it. For the first time in her life, she let herself believe that this could be real. The ride back to town was slow but triumphant. Word had spread fast. By the time their small procession reached Silver Creek, it seemed like half the population had turned out to watch Malcolm Pierce be led to jail. Elizabeth kept her head high, but she felt every stare, every whisper. Then something unexpected happened. Maggie Brennan stepped forward from the crowd. "Miss Morgan," her voice carried across the street. "I believe I owe you an apology." Elizabeth blinked. "Ma'am, I judged you unfairly when you arrived. Assumed the worst." Maggie's expression was firm but sincere. "I was wrong. A woman who risks her life to save a child she's known for 2 weeks. That's not a schemer. That's someone with a good heart." A murmur went through the crowd. Then one by one other voices joined in. "She's right, I heard what happened." Pierce kidnapped the boy. My cousin in Denver said Pierce swindled her sister out of $200. Man's been a snake for years. Good riddance. Something loosened in Elizabeth's chest. She wasn't accepted, not yet, not fully. But the tide was turning. Nate's hand found hers in the darkness. Told you, he said quietly. This town comes around eventually. Eventually, Elizabeth echoed. I can work with eventually. They took Henry home and put him to bed. The boy fell asleep, almost instantly exhausted from his ordeal, but safe, whole alive. Elizabeth sat beside his bed for a long time, just watching him breathe. He's okay, Nate said from the doorway. Kids are resilient. He shouldn't have to be resilient, Elizabeth said. He's 7 years old. I know, Nate said, moving to stand beside her. But he's got you now. He's got both of us. Elizabeth looked up at him. What happens next? Trial, probably. Sheriff says they've been collecting evidence against Malcolm for months, with what happened tonight, plus testimony from the other women he swindled. Nate shrugged. He's going away for a long time. And us? Nate was quiet for a moment. What do you want to happen? First time anyone had ever asked her that question. Not what she needed, not what she should do, what she wanted. I want to stay, Elizabeth said. I want to be part of this family. For real, not just as a housekeeper. I want to stop being afraid of wanting things, of hoping for things, of letting myself believe that good things can last. Nate knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. Then stay. Be part of this family. Stop being afraid. And let me prove to you that good things can last. Give me a chance to prove it. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. It's too soon. We barely know each other. So we'll learn, Nate said. We've got time. I don't know how to do this, Elizabeth whispered. I've never had someone who wanted to stay, who wanted me to stay. I don't know how to trust it. Then don't trust it, Nate said gently. Trust me, one day at a time, one moment at a time. And when you're ready to believe, I'll still be here. Elizabeth looked at this man, this gruff, grieving cowboy who had offered her shelter when she had nothing, who had defended her against a town full of gossips, who had risked his life to save his son and hers. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. One day at a time, she whispered, Okay, it wasn't a promise, it wasn't a declaration, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was enough. Outside, unknown to them, the real battle was just beginning. Malcolm Pierce sat in a jail cell, but he had friends, important friends, and the trial that would determine all their fates was still to come. But for tonight, in this moment, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe, to hope, to imagine a future that included this man, this boy, this home. She had come to Wyoming expecting nothing and finding everything. The journey wasn't over. The hardest parts were still ahead, but she was no longer facing them alone, and that made all the difference. The trial was set for 2 weeks from the day Malcolm Pierce was arrested. 14 days that stretched out like an eternity, each one heavier than the last. Elizabeth spent those days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of daily life, while her mind circled endlessly around the same terrifying thought. She would have to stand in front of the whole town and tell her story. Every shameful detail, every desperate choice, every moment of weakness that had led her to answer a stranger's advertisement and board a train to nowhere. You're going to wear a hole in that floor, Nate said one evening, watching her pace the kitchen for the 100th time. I can't help it, Elizabeth said. Every time I try to sit still, I start thinking about the trial. And then I start thinking about what people will say. And then I just keep spiraling. Nate crossed the room and took her hands, forcing her to stop moving. Eliza, look at me. She looked. You're not alone in this, he said. I'll be there. Henry will be there. Sheriff Cooper says 3 other women are coming to testify. You're not fighting this battle by yourself. I know, Elizabeth said. I know that. But Nate, what if it's not enough? What if Malcolm's lawyer twists everything around and makes me look like the villain? What if the jury believes him instead of me? Then we deal with it, Nate said, his grip tightening. Together, whatever happens, we deal with it together. Elizabeth wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. But she'd spent too many years learning that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. What if they find him innocent, she asked. What happens to us then? Nate's jaw tightened. He won't be innocent. But what if he is? Eliza's Nate's voice was firm, Stop borrowing trouble. We've got enough real problems without inventing new ones. She knew he was right, but knowing and feeling were two different things. A week before the trial, Sheriff Cooper summoned Elizabeth to his office. There were other women there, he said, women Malcolm had victimized. They wanted to meet her before they all had to face him in court. Elizabeth went through every instinct screamed at her to run. The sheriff's office was small and cramped, made smaller by the presence of three other women who all wore the same haunted expression Elizabeth saw in her own mirror. Miss Morgan, Sheriff Cooper said, "These are the other women who've agreed to testify." The first woman was thin, maybe early 30s, with hollow eyes and hands that trembled constantly. Ruth Pierce, she introduced herself, and the irony of the name wasn't lost on anyone. "I actually married him. Unlike you, he showed up for me. We were married within a week." Her voice dropped. "Then he took everything. My money, my freedom, my dignity. Every scrap of who I used to be." She pulled back her sleeve to reveal scars that made Elizabeth's stomach turn. "He did this with a fireplace poker," Ruth said flatly, "because I burned the biscuits." The second woman was younger, maybe 25. "Sarah Brennan," she said, "Maggie's niece from Denver. He took $300 from me, my entire inheritance from my grandmother. Said he needed it for the ranch. There was no ranch. There never was." The third woman was older, maybe 40, with the bearing of someone who had once been proud. "Mary Collins," she said, "school teacher. He courted me for 3 months, made me fall in love with him, then disappeared the night before our wedding. Took my jewelry, my savings, and my reputation." Silence fell over the small room. 4 women, 4 broken lives, all at the hands of one man. "How do you do it?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "How do you stand up in front of everyone and tell them what happened?" Ruth met her eyes. "You tell the truth, and you remember that every word you speak might save the next woman. That's what keeps me going, the thought that maybe, just maybe, I can stop him from doing this to someone else." The night before the trial, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Every creak made her heart race. Every whisper of wind against the windows made her flinch. A soft knock on her door made her sit up. Eliza Nate's voice. "You awake?" She opened the door. He stood there, looking as sleepless as she felt. "Saw your light still on," he said. "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." A pause. "Can I come in?" "Just to talk." Elizabeth nodded and stepped back. They sat on the edge of her bed, careful distance between them at first, but it didn't last. Within moments, they'd gravitated toward each other like magnets. "I was thinking about Catherine tonight," Nate said quietly. Elizabeth's chest tightened, but she listened. "When she was dying, she made me promise something. She said, 'Don't let grief make you small, Nate. Don't let it make you hard.'" His voice roughened. "I've been breaking that promise for 10 months, shrinking into myself, building walls, until you came." He looked at her. "You make me want to be the man she believed I could be. The man I was before I lost her." Nate, Elizabeth started. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," he interrupted. "Standing up there telling your story, but I want you to know something." He took her hand. "No matter what happens in that courtroom, no matter what Malcolm's lawyer says, no matter what the jury decides, you have a home here. You have a family here. You have me." He paused. "That doesn't change. Ever." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She leaned forward and kissed him. Gentle at first, then deeper, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate need into that contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Stay with me tonight," Elizabeth whispered. "Just hold me." "I'd like nothing more," Nate said. They lay down together, fully clothed, just holding each other in the darkness. And for the first time in days, Elizabeth slept. The courthouse was packed when they arrived the next morning. Word of the trial had spread across the territory like wildfire. It seemed like half of Wyoming had turned out to watch. Elizabeth sat in the front row with Nate on one side and Henry on the other. The boy had insisted on coming, despite both adults' protests. "I want to be there for Miss Eliza," he'd said, with such fierce determination that neither of them had the heart to refuse. Malcolm sat at the defense table looking impeccable in an expensive suit. His lawyer, Marcus Webb, was a silver-haired man who radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning too many cases. They both looked like they'd already won. Judge Harrison called the court to order. The territory of Wyoming versus Malcolm Pierce, he announced. Charges include fraud, breach of promise, kidnapping, and assault. The prosecutor, James Hartley, stood. He was young, maybe late 20s, and Elizabeth's heart sank when she saw how nervous he looked. This was his first major trial. Everyone knew it. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hartley began. This is not a complicated story. It's a story of a predator who deliberately, systematically, cruelly targeted vulnerable women for his own profit. He walked slowly past the jury box. Malcolm Pierce presents himself as a gentleman, a businessman, a respectable member of society. But behind that mask is something much darker. A man who advertises for wives he never intends to marry, who takes their money, their hope, their dignity, who abandons them in strange towns with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Over the next few days, you will hear from 4 women who answered Malcolm Pierce's advertisements. 4 women who traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to marry a man who never intended to show up. 4 women whose lives were destroyed by his lies. He paused, letting the words sink in. You will also hear how Mr. Pierce kidnapped a 7-year-old boy named Henry Callahan. How he dragged that child from his bed in the middle of the night and held him hostage in an abandoned cabin. How he threatened to burn down the Callahan Ranch if Elizabeth Morgan, one of his victims, didn't submit to his demands. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense will try to tell you this is a misunderstanding, Hartley continued, that these women are lying, that Mr. Pierce is the real victim here. Don't believe them. Listen to the evidence. Listen to the witnesses. And then ask yourselves, what kind of man does these things and what kind of society lets him get away with it? Marcus Webb stood for the defense, his movements smooth and practiced. A compelling performance. Mr. Hartley, he said, truly moving. But that's all it was, a performance, because the facts of this case tell a very different story. He strolled toward the jury with casual confidence. Malcolm Pierce is a successful businessman who made the mistake of trusting the wrong people. He advertised for a wife perfectly legal and corresponded with Miss Morgan, also perfectly legal. When business complications forced him to delay meeting her train, Miss Morgan made other arrangements. That's not fraud. That's a scheduling conflict. Elizabeth's fists clenched. As for the so-called kidnapping, Webb continued. Mr. Pierce went to the Callahan Ranch to discuss the situation with Miss Morgan. Things got heated. The child wandered off in the confusion and was found a short time later unharmed. Hardly the dramatic crime Mr. Hartley described. The boy was tied to a chair, someone shouted from the gallery. Order Judge Harrison banged his gavel. One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom. Webb smiled thinly. As I was saying, this case is not about a predator and his victims. It's about a successful man being attacked by bitter women who failed to secure the marriages they wanted. It's about jealousy, about revenge, about destroying someone's reputation because they didn't live up to unrealistic expectations. Ruth took the stand first. Hartley led her through her testimony with gentle questions. She told her story in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, but every word landed like a hammer blow. Mrs. Pierce, Hartley said, "Can you tell the court how you met the defendant?" I answered his advertisement in a Boston newspaper. He wrote such beautiful letters, made so many promises. What happened when you arrived in Wyoming? He was there. We were married within a week. Silence. Then he took everything Ruth said. My money said he needed it for the ranch. Then he started controlling things. What I ate, what I wore, who I talked to. Did he ever hurt you physically? Ruth pulled back her sleeve. The scars were visible, even from across the room. He did this with a fireplace poker, she said, because I burned the biscuits. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. I ran away after 3 months, Ruth continued. He found me, dragged me back, told me if I ever tried to leave again, he'd kill me. I've been waiting 4 years for this day. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was brutal. Mrs. Pierce, if that's even your real name, isn't it true you have a history of mental instability? Ruth's face paled. I saw a doctor once. After Malcolm. After what he did to me. A doctor at a sanitarium, Webb said. Because you had a nervous breakdown. Because my husband beat me until I couldn't remember my own name. So you admit your memory is unreliable. That's not what I said. No further questions. One by one, the other women testified. Sarah told her story about the stolen inheritance. Mary about the abandoned wedding. Each time Webb tore them apart on cross-examination, found inconsistencies in their stories, implied they were liars or gold diggers or women scorned. By the time Elizabeth was called to the stand, her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. Miss Morgan Hartley said gently, "Please state your name for the record." Elizabeth Grace Morgan. Miss Morgan, how did you come to be in Silver Creek, Wyoming? Elizabeth told her story. The advertisement, the letters, the borrowed money for the train ticket, the empty platform, the humiliation at the general store. Her voice stayed steady, no tears, just facts laid out like stones building a wall. What happened the night of December 22nd? Hartley asked. I woke to Henry Callahan's scream. By the time I got to his room, he was gone. The window was open. There were boot prints in the snow. What did you do? Nate went after them on horseback. He told me to ride to town for help. She paused. I didn't. A murmur went through the courtroom. Why not? Because Henry was taken to get to me. It was my fault he was in danger. I couldn't just sit there and wait while someone else fixed my problem. So what did you do? Elizabeth met Malcolm's eyes across the courtroom. I followed the tracks to an abandoned cabin. I climbed through a broken window, and I found Henry tied to a chair with Malcolm Pierce standing over him. What happened next? I threw a rock at his head. Someone in the gallery laughed. The judge banged his gavel. Then I untied Henry and told him to run. Elizabeth continued. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination, and Elizabeth braced herself. Miss Morgan, an emotional story, but I have some questions. Elizabeth's stomach tightened. You say you followed tracks in the dark and snow with no experience tracking. Yes, and you climbed through a broken window silently. No one heard you coming. The guard was distracted. Webb smiled thinly. Convenient. You also claim my client was standing over the boy. What was he doing exactly talking to him? Talking, not threatening, not hurting, just talking. He'd kidnapped a 7-year-old child, allegedly. Miss Morgan, isn't it possible you misinterpreted the situation? That my client was simply trying to negotiate by dragging a child from his bed in the middle of the night? Children wander. Perhaps the boy left on his own and my client found him. Something inside Elizabeth snapped. He was tied to a chair. She said, her voice rising. Her whole body shook as she stood up in the witness box. The courtroom went silent. Malcolm Pierce kidnapped a 7-year-old boy. Elizabeth said, her voice fierce and clear. He tied that child to a chair in an abandoned cabin and used him as bait to trap me. He sent men to threaten burning down the Callahan ranch. He told me I was his property, that no one would believe me, that he would destroy my life if I didn't submit. She pointed directly at Malcolm. I am not crazy. I am not lying. I am not a gold digger or a schemer. I am a woman who answered an advertisement because I had nowhere else to go. And I was preyed upon by a monster. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. That man has hurt at least 4 women we know of. How many more are out there? How many more women has he destroyed who were too scared or too ashamed to come forward? She looked at the jury. I am terrified standing here. I am humiliated having my life picked apart in front of strangers. But I would stand here 1,000 times if it meant stopping him from hurting anyone else. Elizabeth sat back down, legs trembling. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Then someone started to clap. 1 person, then 2, then 10. Then the whole room was applauding, despite Judge Harrison's furious attempts to restore order. Through the chaos, Elizabeth met Nate's eyes. He was smiling, tears streaming down his face. After a recess, Hartley stood. Your Honor, the prosecution calls one final witness. He paused for effect. Henry Callahan. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She turned to Nate, who looked equally shocked. He asked to testify. Nate whispered. Sheriff said it was his choice. Henry walked to the stand, so small he could barely see over the edge. The bailiff had to bring a cushion for him to sit on. Henry Hartley said gently, Do you know why you are here today? Yes, sir. To tell the truth about the bad man. Can you tell the court what happened the night you were taken? Henry's voice was small, but clear. I was asleep. Then someone grabbed me, put their hand over my mouth so I couldn't scream. He dragged me out the window. It was really cold. There was another man with a horse. What happened at the cabin? They tied my hands. Mr. Pierce said I had to be quiet or they'd hurt Miss Eliza. I was really scared. But someone came for you. Henry's face lit up. Miss Eliza, she climbed through a window and threw a rock at Mr. Pierce's head and untied me and told me to run. It was really cool. The gallery tittered. Even the judge allowed a small smile. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination. Henry, I'm sorry for what you went through, but I have to ask some questions. Henry nodded, brave despite his fear. You said Miss Morgan came for you, but isn't it true you barely knew her at the time I knew her enough? You'd only met her a few weeks earlier. Isn't it possible you're confused that you wanted her to be your mother so badly that you created this story? I'm not confused, Henry said firmly. I know Miss Eliza isn't my mama. I knew that from the start. I just wish she was. Webb paused. Tell me about your mother, Henry. How did she die? Silence fell over the courtroom like a blanket. Nate half rose from his seat. Elizabeth pulled him back down. Henry's face went still distant. Objection, Hartley said. Not relevant. Goes to the child's state of mind and reliability as a witness, Webb countered. I'll allow it, Judge Harrison said. But tread carefully, Mr. Webb. Henry, can you tell us what happened when your mother died? Long pause. Henry looked at Nate, at Elizabeth, then back to Webb. Mama was sick, he said, his voice very small. For 5 days, the fever wouldn't break. Papa was in the barn. I was with her, holding her hand. Tears started falling. She said, Henry, you're going to be okay. Papa loves you so much. And someday there'll be someone else who loves you too. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. She said, when that person comes, don't be afraid. Let them love you. Let yourself love them back. Then she said, promise me you'll be brave. And I promised. His voice broke. And then she stopped breathing. The courtroom was silent, not a single dry eye. When Miss Eliza came, Henry continued, I thought Mama sent her, like an angel or something. I know that sounds silly, but that's what I thought. He looked at Webb with a child's brutal honesty. Miss Eliza kept my promise to Mama. She was brave for me, so I'm being brave for her. Webb had no more questions. Neither did Hartley. Henry climbed down from the witness box and walked straight to Elizabeth. She gathered him into her arms and held him while he cried. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 agonizing hours during which Elizabeth paced and Nate tried not to break things, and Henry clung to both of them like they might disappear. At 4 in the afternoon, the bailiff came to fetch them. Jury's back. The courtroom was packed, even tighter than before. Everyone stood as the jury entered. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. The foreman, a weathered rancher with kind eyes, stood. We have your honor. On the charge of fraud, how do you find guilty? A gasp swept through the courtroom. On the charge of breach of promise, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. Elizabeth's knees buckled. Nate caught her arm, steadying her. On the charge of assault, guilty. Malcolm's mask finally cracked. His face contorted with rage. He stood shouting, This is a farce. These women are liars. I'll appeal. I'll have this overturned. He reached into his coat. Deputies moved toward him, but Malcolm was faster. He pulled out a small pistol that everyone had somehow missed in the search. Chaos erupted, people screaming, deputies drawing weapons. Nate threw himself in front of Elizabeth and Henry, shielding them with his body. Malcolm pointed the gun at Elizabeth. You think this is over? You think you've won? His laugh was unhinged. If I can't have you, no one will. His finger moved to the trigger. Sheriff Cooper fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. Malcolm jerked the gun, falling from his hand, but not before he pulled the trigger. His shot went wide, hitting the ceiling, sending splinters of wood raining down. Malcolm collapsed. Deputies rushed forward. The sheriff knelt beside him. He's alive, Cooper said. Barely. Get Doc Hartley. Malcolm's eyes found Elizabeth's. Blood bubbled at his lips. I loved you, he whispered, his voice fading. All of you. I just wanted someone to love me. Then his eyes closed. 2 days later, Sheriff Cooper came to the ranch with news. Malcolm Pierce died this morning, he said without preamble. Infection from the gunshot wound. Doc did everything he could, but the bullet had done too much damage. He paused. Judge Harrison officially closed the case. You're free, Miss Morgan. All of you are free. Elizabeth didn't know how to feel. Relief Ward was something that might have been guilt, though she couldn't quite name why. How do I feel? Nothing, she asked Nate later that night. You feel what you feel, he said, or don't feel. There's no right way to react to something like this. The weeks following Malcolm's death were strange and quiet. Elizabeth found herself looking over her shoulder less often, sleeping through the night, laughing at Henry's jokes without the shadow of fear darkening every moment. She and Nate didn't rush into anything. They courted properly. Walks after dinner, conversations on the porch, stolen glances across the kitchen table, building something new while honoring what had come before. 3 months passed, winter gave way to spring, the snow melted and the prairie turned green. With it, something in Elizabeth began to bloom. Life returned to the land in 1,000 small ways. Elizabeth planted a garden, vegetables mostly, but also flowers. Catherine's favorites, Henry told her proudly. Sunflowers and daisies and wild roses. It felt right somehow, honoring the woman who'd come before while building something new. One evening in late May, Elizabeth stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Nate came to stand beside her. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous pastime, Elizabeth replied with a slight smile. Nate smiled too, then his expression grew serious. I need to do something, and I need you to understand why. He reached to his left hand. Slowly, carefully, he removed the gold wedding band he'd worn for 15 years. Elizabeth's breath caught. I loved Catherine, Nate said. I'll always love her. She gave me Henry. She made me believe I could be better than my father. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and you're here. He held out the ring. This is me letting go, not of her memory, not of what we had, but of the ghost I've been holding on to instead of living. He set the ring on the porch railing. Catherine told me not to let grief make me small, not to let it make me hard. You make me want to be big again, soft again, human again. He turned to Elizabeth and took her hands. Eliza Morgan, I'm not asking you to replace Catherine. I'm asking you to be yourself, to be here, to be mine, and let me be yours. He paused. Will you marry me? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Yes, she whispered. God, yes. They kissed as the sun set behind them, painting them both in golden light. Henry, watching from the window, cheered loud enough to wake the dead. 1 year later, on a perfect spring day, they were married in the front room of the Callahan Ranch. It was a small ceremony, just as Elizabeth had insisted. No spectacle, just simple, honest joy. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony. Henry served as ring bearer, so excited he could barely stand still. Maggie Brennan and other townspeople attended. Sheriff Cooper and his wife. People who had become friends, who had become family. Elizabeth wore a dress she'd sewn herself. Simple blue cotton with white lace at the collar. Not fancy, not expensive. But it was hers, made with her own hands, and that mattered more than silk or satin ever could. You look beautiful, Nate said when he saw her. You're supposed to say that, Elizabeth replied. I'm saying it because it's true, Nate said, and his eyes held hers with such love that her breath caught. The vows were simple, traditional, honest promises made between two people who had survived more than most and come out stronger for it. Then Henry squeezed between them. Can I call you Mama now? He asked Elizabeth. For real, Elizabeth knelt to meet his eyes. For real, sweetheart. Forever and always. Henry's smile could have lit the world. The celebration afterward was joyful but modest. Maggie had baked a cake. Neighbors brought food. Someone produced a fiddle and people danced in the front room while Henry ran circles around them, high on happiness and cake. As evening fell, Elizabeth stood at the window watching the stars come out. Nate came to stand beside her. Happy, he asked. More than I ever thought possible, Elizabeth said. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. Nate opened it to find a young woman standing on the porch. She was maybe 20, thin and frightened looking, clutching a worn carpet bag. I'm sorry to intrude, the woman said. Her voice trembled. I heard that you once took in a stranger when she had nowhere else to go. I was hoping. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Elizabeth was already crossing the room. Who are you? She asked gently. My name's Lydia. Lydia Price. I came here to marry a man named Harrison Blake. But when I got to town, he'd already married someone else. And now I've got no money and no family and nowhere to go. Her voice broke on the last word. Elizabeth felt something settle in her chest. Recognition. Understanding. The completion of some circle she hadn't known she was walking. Come inside, she said, putting a hand on Lydia's shoulder. You must be hungry. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread. Lydia's eyes went wide. You'd help me, just like that. You don't even know me. I know enough, Elizabeth said. I know what it's like to be alone in a strange place with nothing but hope and a broken suitcase. I know what it's like to be disappointed by someone who made promises they never intended to keep. And I know that sometimes the only thing standing between a person and despair is one small act of kindness. She guided Lydia toward the house. Nate met them at the door, taking in the situation with a single glance. Got room at the table for one more, he asked. Always, Elizabeth said, smiling at him. They led Lydia inside into warmth and light and the smell of good food. They fed her, let her cry, let her tell her story, and when she was done, they offered her the same thing Nate had once offered Elizabeth, a place to stay, honest work, a chance to get back on her feet. No questions asked about her past, just an open door and open hearts. That night, after Lydia was settled in the spare room and Henry was asleep, Elizabeth stood by the window looking out at the moonlit prairie. Nate came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You know what you just started, don't you? He said quietly. What? You just opened our home to every woman in the territory who needs help. Word's going to spread. There'll be more after Lydia. I know, Elizabeth said. Is that all right? Nate kissed the top of her head. More than all right. Catherine would have loved it. Elizabeth turned in his arms to face him. And you, me too, Nate said. This house has been too quiet for too long. Time to fill it with life again. They stood together in the darkness, holding each other, while around them the house settled into sleep. Outside the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars. Inside, 4 people who had all been lost and alone had found something precious. Home. Not the place they'd been born, not where they'd run from, but where they'd chosen to stay. Where they'd chosen each other. Where they'd built something real from the ruins of broken promises and shattered dreams. Elizabeth had come to Wyoming expecting nothing and finding everything. She'd come as a mail-order bride nobody wanted and become a wife, a mother, a friend, a savior. She'd come alone and built a family. She'd come broken and found healing. The journey hadn't been easy. The scars remained, but they'd become part of her story, proof not of weakness, but of strength. Evidence that she'd survived things that should have destroyed her and come out whole on the other side. And now she would help others do the same. 40 years later, Elizabeth Callahan sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe style she'd worn as a young woman. Her hands, weathered by decades of work, rested gently on the arms of the rocking chair Nate had built her on their 10th anniversary. Henry approached now, a man of 47 with gray threading through his dark hair. His own children played in the yard, 3 girls who had never known hunger or fear or uncertainty. Mama, he said, settling into the chair beside her, the title still filled her with warmth even after all these years. Lydia's just taken in another one. Young woman from Ohio. Same story. Promised marriage abandoned at the station. Elizabeth nodded. That makes 137. Do you ever regret it? Henry asked. Coming here, everything that happened. Elizabeth watched the sun paint the prairie in shades of gold. Inside the house, Lydia was helping the new arrivals settle in, offering the same comfort Elizabeth had once received. The sounds of women's voices of life continuing drifted through the open windows. Nate had been gone 3 years now, passed peacefully in his sleep surrounded by family. But she felt him here, still in every board of this house, in every memory etched into these walls. Not for a single moment, she said finally. Not one. Henry took her hand. You saved a lot of women, Mama, including yourself. Elizabeth smiled. No, sweetheart. This place saved me. Your father saved me. You saved me. She squeezed his hand. I just passed it on. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, Elizabeth closed her eyes and let herself remember. The frightened girl on the frozen platform. The boy who'd called her Mama before knowing her name. The man who'd offered shelter when she had nothing. She'd come here expecting nothing and found everything. Home wasn't a place. It was the people who chose to stay to fight, to love, to build together. And Elizabeth Morgan Callahan had chosen it every single day. That made all the difference.